Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the launch of the Gender Equality Index UK. Always welcome applause. I can't accept it because I have barely done any of the work the people who in front of me has. I'm Professor Hee-Jung Chung. I'm the director of the King's Global Institute for Women's Leadership. The UK stands at a crossroad, facing economic challenges, regional disparities, and persistent inequalities that define the socio-economic context of the UK today. Such challenges that we face today really demands a tool that helps us understand the problems that we face, but also the solutions that could help solve these issues. The Gender Equality Index, we hope that is a tool that could really help in this manner, shedding lights on the complexity between the inequalities, not only between men and women, but also men and women, and the lived experiences of people across the country. It is also one of the first index of its kind to map, analyze the socio-economic outcomes of men and women across 372 UK localities. It represents a real transformational step forward. It captures gender disparities kind of going beyond the conventional indexes that we're used to, bringing in some more important and very important indexes such as kind of involvement in and the division of unpaid labor, participation in leadership positions, as well as community health. This comprehensive index really is vital for us to confront some of the challenges that we face as a society today, the persistent north-south divide, the ongoing economic recovery from the pandemic, but also the urgent issues around stagnant productivity and a lot of the kind of political disenfranchisement that we see in the UK today. So the GEIUK index is not just an abstract tool, which is actually, it's a really cool tool. For those of you who haven't tried it out, it's really colorful and very, very nice tool to kind of play around with and very accessible. But it's not just an academic tool for us to kind of study the world. It actually provides some actionable insights for policymakers, for stakeholders, for campaigners and communities alike to better understand where we are and where we need to go in the future. And doing so, it really invites us to understand gender equality, not as a standalone issue, but something that we can do to build as a foundation for resilience, an equitable, and a thriving local economy that serves both women and men. So, enough from me. I'm delighted to introduce our research fellow, Caitlin Schmid, who will be presenting the findings, and the presentation will be followed by an exceptional panel who will explore the complex links between gender equality, regional disparities, economic productivity. They will also unpack the gender dimensions of the UK enduring north-south divide, discuss targeted policy interventions to address some of the most significant issues that has been identified by our index. So our panel includes Maya Oppenheim, a freelance journalist and a former women's correspondent at The Independent, Professor Kate Pickett, professor of epidemiology at the University of York and the director of the Bourne and Bradford Center for Social Change. We were going to have Dani Sriskaran Daraja, Chief Executive of the New Economic Foundation, but he was unable to join us today because of some personal issues. Having said that, the chair of today, the Honorable Julia Gillard, the 27th Prime Minister of Australia and the chair of the King's Global Institute for Women's Leadership, will be kind of providing some of his thoughts on his behalf. So after we've heard from Caitlin, we'll be hearing from the panel, but after that, we will come back to you for any questions, and there will be some Q&A time as well. So it's my pleasure to introduce you, Dr. Caitlin Schmid.
Thank you so much, Hee-Jung, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. It's such a pleasure to be finally standing here and sharing the findings of the Gender Equality Index with you. This has been a long-standing project at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, and a wonderful collaboration with Jim Dimma, Noel Ona, Anne-Laure Humbert, Victor Soho, Minna Cooper-Coles, and of course the rest of the Jewel team. And it was made possible by the support of the Lloyds Banking Group, for which we're very grateful. What is the Gender Equality Index? It's the first UK-wide measure of gender equality across the 4 nations in the UK. We measure and map women's and men's outcomes across 372 local authorities in the 4 nations, which provides a granular picture of gender and geographic inequalities across multiple domains of women's and men's lives. This gives us a benchmarking tool for policy, research, and also for advocacy, and you will all be able to access all of this information on our interactive, very colourful website under genderequalityindex.uk. Just to give you a quick idea, and you have this in your executive summary, the indicators that we're including, these are all existing data that we've compiled and harmonized, and we are looking at 6 domains of women's and men's lives. So paid work, issues relating to employment, unpaid work, domestic work and childcare, then outcomes related to money, so wealth and income, power and participation, which measures voice in the community, as well as local representation and business leadership, and educational outcomes and health outcomes. And when we speak of gender equality, of course we want to compare women's and men's outcomes locally, but we know that looking at gender gaps alone can give us an incomplete picture of the dynamics that actually shape women's and men's lives. And for this reason, we're going beyond just gender gaps to measure also how women locally compare to other women in the country to see whether they're falling behind or pulling ahead. And we're doing the same for men as well. What do we find? First of all, sad news. No local authority has achieved full gender equality. We see that men show higher outcomes in paid work, money, and power and participation, while women show higher outcomes in education, health, but they also spend more time still on unpaid work. Gender equality is greatest in London, or in local authorities concentrated in London, as well as local authorities concentrated in the north. But if we look at the 3 measures in conjunction, we see that these results come from very different dynamics. We see that local authorities in London tend to show higher outcomes for women and men in addition to gender equality, whereas local authorities in the Northwest tend to show higher gender equality levels with poor outcomes for women and men. So it is shared disadvantage, whereas in London it's more shared advantage. When we look at the areas where gender equality is lowest, we see that these are local authorities are concentrated in Wales, Northern Ireland, and the east of England, Yorkshire and the Humber. We see that those areas where gender equality is lowest, both women and men tend to be falling behind. Together, this gives us a picture of 4 distinct types of gender equality that exist across the UK. We've identified 1 in 7 local authorities that can be classified as prime parity. They show the highest gender equality outcomes and very high socioeconomic outcomes for both women and men. They're often concentrated in the east of England, such as St Albans, in London, such as Wandsworth, or the east of England, for example, Guildford. Contrast this with local authorities, 1 in 5, which are we term equal erosion. While they do have high gender equality, this emerges from poor outcomes for both women and men. We see local authorities concentrated in the Northwest, such as Blackpool, Wales, such as Neath Port Talbot, and the West Midlands, such as Stoke-on-Trent. Then the majority of local authorities fall into this group, partial progress. We see moderate gender equality outcomes paired with moderate outcomes for women and men. These are areas concentrated in the southeast, such as Canterbury, Scotland, in Midlothian, I think I said it right, and southwest, such as Somerset. Then finally, an area of deep disparities, low gender equality and low outcomes for both women and men. These are areas in Yorkshire and the Humber, such as Bradford, Wales, such as Merthyr Tydfil, and Northern Ireland, such as Derry. And these are also characterized by challenges faced due to the decline of their traditional economies. On a more hopeful note, we know that gender equality is not a zero-sum game. Our index shows that it flourishes where both women and men do well. We see that there are higher outcomes for both women and men when gender equality is high. We see that there's greater local productivity, greater economic activity, higher full-time employment, and higher wages. And while our index can't establish causality between these two things, we do know from existing research that gender equality tends to be a driver of economic growth. This is research provided by the UN, OECD, and the World Bank. Gender inequalities are especially large in the domains of unpaid work and power and participation. And conversely, we see that in areas where men spend more time on unpaid work, they have higher outcomes as well as, of course, higher gender equality. And this again supports findings. We can't establish causality between this, but it supports existing research that shows where men are more involved in childcare, they tend to have better health outcomes, they tend to have higher marital satisfaction, they tend to take better care of themselves and sleep better, and also their children tend to have better educational outcomes. So again, this underlines the point that gender equality is not a zero-sum game. Finally, if we map the 4 types of gender equality that combines these 3 measures of the index together, we see great divergence in outcomes that confirm the north-south divide. Prime parity is mainly found in the south of England, although also a few more wealthier areas in Scotland, and poor outcomes are concentrated in the north of England as well as Scotland, Wales. Now, where do we go from here? We can accelerate progress by reducing inequalities in unpaid work and power and participation. I think the specifics of this will be addressed in the panel later. If not, I'm happy to pick them up with you later over a glass of wine. Then also, greater involvement in childcare and domestic work benefits men. This is a really important point. So we really need to encourage it and do more to encourage it, because this is really where the progress is stalling. Then also importantly, regional development benefits from a gender perspective. Our labor markets are gendered, and our economies depend on both women and men doing well. We can't trade those off against each other. So we have to understand the economy by also looking at unpaid work if we want to improve the living standards of women and men across the 4 nations. Now, we've got some fantastic visual support from Pentagram, who helped us with the design of this website and the whole visual identity. And so I'm very happy to share a little preview of our website that you can go on to explore the maps and all the data and dig in. You'll here see all the different maps that I explained, the gender equality measure, women's outcomes measure, and men's outcomes measure. And explore the key findings in more detail. And of course, you have this in your executive summary, and you'll be able to download the full report from the website as well. So, without further ado, thank you very much. I am going to hand over to Gloria.
Well, thank you so much, Caitlin, for that presentation and for all the work. I'm going to invite everybody.
Sorry.
I thought you were coming as a group. Yes, thank you for that presentation, but more than anything else, thank you for all of the work that you've done to make this possible. And I know that there was a team involved, but your personal labour and leadership was very, very extensive. So thank you for leading this project. I am joined by a great panel, so what I'm going to do is just dig in with a couple of questions to each of the panel members, and I do have some reflections from Danny, who unfortunately wasn't able to be with us, so I'll try and summarise those briefly. But Kate, I'm going to go to you first. You are an expert in health, in population health. You are very deeply involved in the Born in Bradford population study, which is one of the longest running, deepest, most impressive in the world. You've heard Caitlin say on a few occasions then that the nature of this research doesn't enable us to do causation, but we certainly do find a very clear correlation between greater gender equality and better outcomes for men. I mean, from all the work you've done, all the population health data that you've worked with over your career, how does that resonate with you? Can you give us a sense of what might be the causal chain there?
Sure. I mean, I'm delighted to see this index. You know, more data is always fantastic, isn't it? And excuse me, it's always really good to think about this at different scales and in different perspectives. And if we look internationally, you know, the UK is a very unequal country, and our gender equality is low compared to other countries. On the World Economic Forum's gender equality index, we don't do well. It correlates with our income inequality. And the countries that are doing really well, Norway, Finland, Sweden, usual suspects, do really well on this measure of men contributing to unpaid work and sharing domestic labour with women. And we see better outcomes for them in health and for the children. And so what you're finding sits very nicely with what we find internationally. I don't think you should worry too much about whether or not there's causal analysis, you know, smells causal, looks causal, you know, probably is causal. I mean, any of us who've got a helpful partner at home know how much difference it makes. We also know from work across the world on development and women's health and children's health that whenever we invest in women's education, women's equality, women's livelihoods, sure, women do better, children do better, but men always do better then as well. Their health improves. So women are key. And I think you've picked up nicely in your index something that we know from the international literature, but you can show it now at this local authority level. And I think that's hugely important for policy making. This idea that gender equality is not a zero-sum game. I think that's a really great insight to be able to take to policymakers at national level, at local authority level, and even more finely local as well.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to you, Kate, but just on that zero-sum game point, let me go to Maya, because from your experience in the world of journalism, I mean, you know what it's like to bring complex stories, complex facts to people to try and help them digest them, but you also know the power of communications to shape attitudes. And we've certainly seen a lot in the media and from the polarised world of politics, particularly the US, but not just the US, that is shaping a narrative. It's a zero-sum game. You know, more for the girls means less for the boys, more for the women means less for the men, more for people of colour means less for white people, and on it goes. I mean, how do you think we can take material like this and perhaps, you know, change and shape a different set of attitudes?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. And just to say the research is amazing, you know, the world is feeling quite bleak right now, and it's just so heartening, you know, to have something to feel optimistic about. And this empirical kind of solid, comprehensive, it's so detailed, you know, you couldn't kind of complain you haven't looked at one, you know, nothing's left out really. You've covered a lot of ground. So yeah, how can it kind of challenge this narrative that we are seeing more and more and more, which is essentially being pushed by the manosphere, by the rise of online misogynistic influences, which is that, you know, white men are feminism's, are gender equality's biggest victims, and this research ultimately turns that on its head, and it says that actually with gender equality, everyone wins. And I think what's really amazing about the research is, it gives a pragmatic and economic basis. And obviously, you know, you've got that moral and ethical reasoning to explain why we should have a gender equal society. But this is just saying, actually, no, this works on so many different levels. But yeah, I think this view that we're seeing is getting more and more common, this idea that actually, And I know, you know, we might sit here and laugh about it, but there are a lot of people out there, mostly men, unsurprisingly, who do see society as culturally, as institutionally sexist towards men. And yeah, as the far right is growing, as we can see, you know, misogyny is at the heart of so much far right ideology. So I think this research is such a powerful, yeah, heartening, like I say, antidote to that view that, yeah, that it's a zero-sum game. And as this shows, it's not.
It's definitely not. That's what the research does show. And Kate, coming back to you, I mean, Bradford's name actually came up in Caitlin's presentation, and you know from your work in Bradford that when you look at regional factors, you know, the economy, economic dislocation, lack of jobs or lack of well-paying and secure jobs, poor housing, you know, poor health, poor education, these all go together. There are lots of regional characteristics, and now we've got this very helpful data on how that relates to gender equality. I mean, given all your experience thinking about place-based solutions and the levers that can change outcomes in communities, what would you say policymakers should be doing in places like Bradford and other places that are either in the low outcomes and it's shared gendered inequality, or there are places that are low outcomes but there is high levels of gender inequality?
Well, I want to say something encouraging, and firstly, that is about the interest of many local authorities and combined authorities with elected mayors in addressing these local and regional inequalities. We've been doing a lot of work recently on women's health, well-being, economic well-being as well, in the north, northwest, Yorkshire and Humber, northeast. We produced a big report with a lot of disappointing and discouraging statistics about the position of women in the north versus the south. But our mayor in West Yorkshire, Tracy Braben, our mayor in the northeast, Kim McGuinness, were hugely interested in that. And last week we had a women's health summit in the north and developed a Woman of the North charter to which both of those mayors signed up. And I know there's huge interest as well in Greater Manchester with Andy Burnham. So I think we have got a layer of policy making that didn't used to be there, where women's issues are very live to those female elected mayors, and they're really trying to think about what can they do to empower women, to provide more economic opportunities, educational opportunities. How can they use devolved budgets to support career development for young women in schools, women's participation in various economic opportunities? So I think this index will add to that. That will be fuel for them to advocate for even more devolved powers and cash to be able to do more for women in the region. And it will bolster their efforts to do that. And then I think in various cities as well, we see city-based interest in changing things for women. And in Bradford, we've spent, well, it's well over 10 years now. I used to say 10 years, but it keeps creeping up, and I need to keep up. We spent a huge amount of time developing a relationship between research and the local authority. And they now do act on the basis of research. So they're sort of research ready, they're research listening, they're keen to use our research findings to change a city. And we have a strapline for Born in Bradford sometimes say, can a research project change a city? And the answer is yes, it can. So I think the question for you is, can a research project change a nation? And I think the answer to that is yes, it can, if we use it wisely.
There's many threads in that I want to pursue, and I'm going to pursue the first of them with Maya, which is we've just really had a very practical example of what difference political leadership makes. So the leaders that you point to are actually making a difference for their communities. And yet this very data set, what Caitlin's put together for us, shows that when we're looking at gender inequality, one of the key dimensions is political empowerment, not enough women leaders. You know, from your point of view, from journalism, from covering women leaders, what can we do to change that?
Okay, so another great question. Obviously, you are, an example of how it can happen, and I do believe in that quote. I don't know who said it, but someone somewhere, but it's hard to be what you can't see. So I do think it is important to have role models. But yeah, there's a whole kind of complex cocktail of issues at play that do prevent women from going into politics, whether that's local politics or here, as like parliamentary politics. But I guess, you can take that, as a global, structure too. So I think that abuse that female politicians face a lot, there's a lot of it, that has to, be considered. There's so many women MPs who, when they've stood down in this country, they have explicitly cited the abuse and the harassment that they have suffered. So research from Foresight Society, a leading gender equality charity, found that 7 in 10 women in this country say they would not become a politician because of fears of facing abuse or harassment in the role. And I think that, I guess that fits into a wider issue of so many women in the public eye more generally face a lot of vitriolic abuse. And I still feel like there's such a big problem with double standards. People are, they would say one thing about a woman in the limelight, but they wouldn't say it about a man. And that we ultimately, so many people still hold women to much higher standards. It's just that attitude of boys will be boys. But there's also, structural, material things that stop women from going into politics. So here in the UK, that would be incredibly long hours, very antiquated, I can never say that word, sorry, old-fashioned, working conditions. And also the fact that, the high cost of childcare is a big, big problem, and that, that's not just for politics, that's for all different types of sectors. But an overall point that is obviously referenced in the research, but I think, we need to, you can't really make too much, is the fact that, women are more likely to take on the burden of unpaid labour. So whether that's childcare for your kids, whether that's for an elderly or a sick relative, and also domestic duties, and that is still such a big problem. But like this research shows, when men are doing more unpaid labour, they benefit too, which I think is really, really interesting. But I guess, to end on a positive note would be that, we currently have the highest proportion of women in our parliament now than we've ever had before. Since, records began. So that's definitely positive. But also, we need to go beyond just talking about representation. So I'm just going to read a very short extract from my book, which says, while getting more women into senior positions so our institutions better reflect wider society is important, it would be naive to assume that simply getting more women into positions of power will instantaneously turn the world into a utopia. Not all women want to tackle the gender pay gap. Not all women want to create a less racist, less patriarchal and more equal society. You only have to look at the sentiments espoused by some of the most famous female politicians in the UK currently to see that this is not the case. And so, to end actually on a positive note, it's just that, so last year, at the end of last year, I interviewed lots of new female MPs, and they said, that Parliament now feels less misogynistic and that the bubble of Westminster is finally bursting. So I think, things are looking up in terms of, that issue.
And would you say sort of traditional media is better than it used to be? The problem now is more the social media, online media than, the
when you say traditional media,
BBC, television news, more traditional radio news, newspapers.
Oh, is it more gender equal, or is the coverage?
Is it more less likely to be sexist towards women in politics or women in other very visible leadership
that's
positions?
a really good question. I think it very much depends on which media outlet you're looking at, and that some will be better than others. But there's some good stuff out there and some not great stuff, I would say.
Want to name any names? I'm going to actually follow on from what you said, pointing to the current national parliament here in the UK. You talked, Kate, about local leadership. If Danny was here, he would have, I think, joined these points by looking through an economic lens at what can be achieved beyond a regional development perspective and nationally. And so I want to just quickly summarise some of the things he would have said if he was here, and Caitlin, I might get you to then comment on them. He certainly said we should be very worried about the increasing inequalities in the UK, that poverty's on the rise, regional inequalities are stubbornly unchanged, and the super rich are getting ridiculously rich. And as the new index shows, gender inequality remains an abhorrent part of this picture. He congratulates Caitlin and the team on the work. He then wants to reflect on how this material could be used for inclusive growth. And he says that whilst regional work does matter, you also need the national government to, in his words, stop doing silly things. These are Danny's words. Things like putting airports in the southeast, which deepen regional inequality, welfare cuts, which will drive poverty and inequality, all sorts of policies that have adverse impacts on paid and unpaid care. And that those national policies have to be got right if we're going to move beyond the sort of gender inequality that the index shows. Caitlin, you've reflected in the material that we've distributed in the executive summary on what national government could do or should do. Do you want to share some of that with us?
Of course. Well, I guess there's always the interplay between the national and the local. Of course, we have a drive for devolution and regional growth that is also driven from the national level. And I think we have to, at the national level, really seriously recognize how harmful gender and income inequality is for not just the economy, but for people's well-being. As the spirit level showed us so compellingly. And I wish that the government would take a gender lens for their regional approaches. Their Invest 2030 strategy for the modern industry in the UK, it requires a gender lens. I hope the index can also help us kind of anticipate where structural changes, how that might affect women and men differently if we look at the industrial profiles across the 4 nations to see, which area, if we're investing in certain sectors, which areas will benefit and how can we ensure that those benefits are distributed more equally. The index captures gender and geographic inequalities. Geographic inequalities are a proxy for income inequality in the UK. We need to take this seriously and start addressing them better, because currently we're just kicking the can down the road and we see the growing discontent. I found it quite interesting. We looked at where Runcorn sits on our index, and of course that's the constituency. It's a local authority of Halton, so there's other constituencies there too, but it is one of our equal erosion places. So it's one where both women and men are falling behind, but they are equal to each other. This is something we need to take seriously, and we need to push that narrative that gender equality is good for regional development and for women and men. And I think we can push the narrative that is now falsely being spewed that, we're pitting groups against one another. Our economy depends on all groups of women and men doing well. And I wish the national level would take that seriously.
And looking at the domains that you identified, you've broken the regions up into 4 categories, but there's no category of doing economically well and being highly gender unequal. That's not a thing. So that's telling us that you really can't hope to have a prosperous area with opportunities that is going ahead on all of the indicators that the index picks up that still has high dimensions of gender inequality. You've got to address the gender inequality to address the rest of it. Was there anything when you were putting it together, when you were defining, you know, prime parity and the other categories, that surprised you, you didn't expect to see when you first started on this project?
Yeah, I guess a surprising and disappointing finding is that a narrow gender gap doesn't necessarily mean isn't necessarily good news. We have to look at the wider structures and women's and men's overall outcomes and how that might produce the gender gap. We know, an example is in Manchester, we know the gender pay gap is below the UK average, but it's actually because women, and especially men in Manchester, earn below the national level. So that is kind of disappointing and complicates, or at least adds nuance to the discussion around gender equality, and I think we have to take that seriously, and we need to ensure that the message is carried to all corners of the nation that women and men doing equally well is good for both.
And obviously recently there were local elections in the UK and much commentary on the results. I'd have to say my eyes were more on the Australian election, so you'll have to forgive where the results were very good. So you'll have to forgive me if I'm not the master of the details of who won where. But is there anything that you would extrapolate from the index into that sort of localised politics?
Yeah, I think we see there's areas where women and men are clearly falling behind, and they're falling behind in the UK, and if we compare it to Europe, they're falling behind quite a bit, and we should all be upset by that. Our wealth depends on the wealth of the poorest, so I hope we can use this tool to go to local policymakers and also hopefully national policymakers, but we also want local activists and advocates to use it to dig into this evidence base and take it for their campaign work. And of course, us at the Institute, we want to use this tool to now actually start all the fun work, which is looking at other outcomes and seeing how can we match this to, you know, social attitudes or voting behaviors, and also potentially looking at, like, how does it map onto local authority infrastructure, wealth, and spending too. Might that shed light on the dynamics that produce the very disparate outcomes for women and men across the 4 nations?
Is there anything, Kate, just the relationship between you know, political trends, what you're seeing regionally, how it relates to gender inequality? How do you think about that?
I mean, I feel frustrated, I think, like the rest of you, at what is happening at national level, and I'm seeing much stronger leadership for women at a local, at a regional level, and in the devolved nations as well, in Wales and in Scotland, quite often innovative policy making, things like the Future Generations Act in Wales, which, because it's focusing on children's well-being, actually has a lot that's good for women as well, and similar attitudes in Scotland. And at the moment, what I feel is happening nationally, politically, in reaction to things like Runcorn and the local election results, is a race to the bottom with the far right, instead of the provision of charismatic leadership that might give hope and aspiration to those areas where both men and women are doing equally poorly. I was with Australians when those results were coming in, and
Drinking heavily.
they were drinking heavily, but I was not.
Even though it was only mid-morning in the UK, I mean, don't like to judge. Yeah.
I think that kind of leadership can carry a long way, and I think at the moment we seem to have leadership that's frightened of the electorate, frightened of engaging in the nuanced debate, and I think there's an appetite for it in the country, actually. People are not stupid. They know that Britain's not doing very well. They know that inequalities are great. They know that they're falling behind. They're worried about their children. At the moment, they're just being fed rather simplistic messages. And so I think we need to engage in big grown-up conversations across the nation about the kinds of policies that address gender equality and then raise everybody's well-being.
And would you, from your knowledge of the media landscape, think this is a world in which we can have big grown-up conversations, given how information gets to the people? There's obviously a journey between when a politician says something and when it lands through all sorts of media pipes and, sites and social media and all the rest of it. Is that flattening our ability to have big grown-up conversations?
I just think that there's a real lack of respect, really, for a lot of the British public, of just treating them like they're idiots and thinking they can't understand nuance and complexity. And no, I'm not for that at all, And I think that, we need to stop, putting things in such a kind of binary, simplistic way and pushing this view of like who's the most marginalised and oppressed in the room kind of thing, of always trying to choose one group and just kind of, just this zero-sum game thing, which I think, it's not a narrative I agree with, but I do think it explains a lot of what's being pushed at the moment.
No, yeah, absolutely. And when people are anxious about their own position, and as Caitlin's and the material shows, there are many regions in the UK where people are understandably anxious about their position. They should be anxious about their position. That it's then very, if you're receiving a message that more for someone else means less for you and you already feel under incredible pressure, it's very hard. So to turn that around, that there's actually a way of all rising together is really important. Okay, Caitlin, are there any other reflections that you want to on the conversation or on the material before we go out for some questions?
Please, So I think I would like to end on the point that we need to get men more involved in unpaid work. And I kind of gave you a little tease in the presentation. I do think we have to normalise flexible working and grant men access to flexible working. They do request it but don't always get it. That is important for them to be able to engage more in childcare. We need better paid and longer paternity leave, because we know it's very important for men to be involved in the early stages of a child's life. That keeps them more involved later on too. And childcare was mentioned, how expensive it is. I know the government is trying to up the free hours, but it's still, if we look at international comparisons, it's just so expensive, and we're not getting richer. We're living still through a cost of living crisis. So we have to think about these ways in which we can get men more engaged and not financially penalise them for it, and also get them, to hopefully start changing the culture around care, where it's not just something that is done for women, and we also see it, importantly, as an integral part of the economy.
Well, I think we've got some men who are modelling unpaid work for us by taking microphones around. Thank you very much for volunteering to do that. That's kind of you. So we'll go now for a few questions. We might, given you're in perfect position for the two people here, if you want to I'll take a few this side, and then we'll get a response, and then we'll come over the other side, please.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the fantastic discussion. Question was about, I guess we've established that there's an evidence base for gender equality being good for productivity. If we think about the micro behaviours and then the behavioural change that has to come in order to influence and drive more productivity, what are the big hitters? And if you'll indulge me, how does that link to the Gender Equality Index? And an Australian context would be wonderful.
So micro behaviours that feed into productivity. Yes, okay. We'll take that. Then, yes, person next to you, hello.
Hello, thank you so much. And just Honourable Julia Gillard, huge fan.
Side note.
My question is whether the data set accounts for intersectional identities. So, for example, ethnicity, because we know that Black and brown women typically tend to have worse outcomes. And I'm just curious to know, in certain regions where there's a higher immigrant population, whether you saw some interesting trends. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll just take, there was one question here, just you, just in front of you. And then we'll come for an answer, and then I'll go over here, and we'll be able to do, I think, a couple more rounds. So thank you.
Hi. So my question was a little bit personal. So I wanted to ask, I had written my dissertation on the lack of political representation of women, and particularly in South Asia. So I was really inspired by your speech in the Parliament, the misogyny speech 2012, which I am sure most of the people in this room have heard. And so I was just wondering that I'm sure you would have come across various challenges, especially sexism and misogyny. Would you mind sharing what pushed you to that point? That what was some of those challenges which pushed you to the point to, come forward in the Parliament and say that speech out loud, which I think a lot of women in this room are thankful for, because without that, a lot of us also felt seen and heard, even though we were not at a position as high as yours, because we also experience it in our everyday lives. Yeah, so that was my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Caitlin, do you want to take the question on ethnicity and how that relates to the data set?
Absolutely. So what we're using is existing data, and we did an extensive review of what is out there. Obviously, we wanted to be sure to not obscure other forms of equality or inequality by creating this index. Sadly, obtaining multivariate data, so that is data that is disaggregated by multiple characteristics, especially at the local authority level that we're looking at, is extremely difficult. The census does allow it to a certain extent, but it doesn't capture all the indicators we're interested in to measure gender equality. So instead what we did, well, I'll say, unless we get better data, for now we're limited to this, but one thing, of course, we wanted to look at how we could maybe factor in ethnicity, but also age, and we would want to do that with other protected characteristics, is that for our 4 types of gender equality, we did kind of look at the overall age and ethnic profiles of places. And again, I have to say, we can't establish causality, but we did see that more diverse areas had better outcomes.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. Now, on the productivity point, very happy to take reflections from the panel. I think, increasing productivity is such a complex combination of your big capital infrastructure projects at a national level, poor connectivity, roads, rail, airports, ports, all of that can cost you a lot in national productivity. And of course, when it comes to many communities that I'm sure in the index have turned up as equally disadvantaged, they do not have great connectivity to the rest of the nation by rail and things like that, even though the UK is really a very small place when you stop and think about it, says the Australian. Then I think within businesses there's also the way in which capital and labour practices are put together and in what sorts of combinations. And where obviously it's beyond the realm of tonight, but in the midst of a revolution around that as AI re-engineers a whole lot of working processes, but we're not at the stage yet where I think we can be very clear about what sort of productivity changes that's going to give in the national economy over the longer term. And then I think there probably are individual behaviours, which I think was where your question was at, micro behaviours, that people, if you're in an environment that is opportunity rich, where you see people working, people getting ahead, people able to amass some wealth over their life, I think that does drive some cultural cues and behaviours that then put people on a path upwards. And I think the converse can apply, but you
I would just focus on
yeah.
health and well-being as well. We have very high levels of sickness absence. That's very much related to poor quality work. Why wouldn't you go off sick if you're a little bit ill, if you have a shitty job? So all of these things are sort of bound up together. And I think we hear so much focus on productivity, economic growth, and actually if we could focus on well-being and growing the health and well-being of the population, we would get that productivity. Yeah, we do need the infrastructure too, as well.
A few good train lines.
Yeah, a few good train lines. Be really helpful, especially across.
Across.
Yeah.
Okay, across. Anything you wanted to say on that productivity point?
It's not quite my area but I guess it feels like we've got around 34 million girls and women in this country, and that there's a lot of potential that's just not being tapped into if you look at, say, the makeup of who's in politics and who's not. And then if you look at, say, the pandemic, countries that were led by women, researchers found, they locked down more quickly, they had better outcomes in terms of less deaths, essentially. And I just think that, that there's a lot of very productive women out there that aren't really getting much of a look in terms of the labour market, because they are still having to take on the lion's share of unpaid labour.
And then the very quick answer to your question, given sort of not the topic for the night, but what's come to be known as the misogyny speech was really given in a parliamentary context where I very unexpectedly got an opportunity to say things that had been, whirring in my mind for a while, and gave me an opportunity to give a speech like that. But I do think that one of the hallmarks of the recent era, the Me Too movement, a whole series of other things, is that women and male allies are less likely now to think that keeping quiet is ultimately going to be a strategy for change. I mean, we only, and really this relates to the index, we only can solve problems if we can see them, if we talk about them, if we've got the information at our fingertips. So, if women are the subject of sexist or gendered treatment and don't call it out, then we never get to the next part, which is the change agenda. So thanks for your question. I'm going to take a few questions on this side now. What I might do is get you to go at the back, and we've got one in the middle, so that'll be a lot of passing of the mic in, and then we might come back out, yes, to you, and then we'll pass it along.
Thank you all for a fascinating talk, and the research looks incredible, but it also pulls out a really key message that I think any of us involved in working gender equity and campaigning for it are sort of always craving for, which is about this zero sum, and how do we get men engaged in it so that they see this is not a disadvantage to them. I suppose my question is, did you see anything in the research around age? Because in the public discourse at the moment, there's a lot of conversation around young men coming into the workforce and ultimately into leadership and policy making. And I think a lot of us are quite concerned about what that looks like and some of the changes. So firstly, was there anything in the research that showed anything around age? And secondly, is there any thought that the Institute has put to how we could take some of this messaging and make it relevant and engaging to young men and try to get that message out? Because I think that is an audience that feels like, could benefit from this messaging.
Thank you. And can you just pass the mic sort of diagonally forward? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. I think you distilled at the end there, Caitlin, some of the three, key policy changes that could be made in order to make progress on the back of this data, being, policies around flexible working for men, better paternity leave, or policies and stuff around childcare. We've alluded to the rise of reform in a UK context, but also the changing political dynamics globally. What do you think are the sort of main political barriers to those policies being enacted in the here and now, and what can we be doing to change that?
Yeah, of course. Yep. So quickly to the question on age. So it's pretty much the answer I gave this lady over here, which is that we would want to disaggregate by gender and age for all local authorities. Currently, we couldn't do that for all of the data we're including. But we did look at the age profiles. We did look at, where are there big young populations, but we then more related it to working age families to try to understand if that has an impact. And also where are there more, 65 plus individuals. But this is something we could definitely do more research on. And then the campaigning. So there are fantastic organizations out there, of course, that work specifically with men. Now, yeah, the white ribbon. Oh, of course, now that I'm on the spotlight, I'm forgetting all the names of them. But so they would be the experts to take this forward, and if they're listening, then we would like to collaborate with you, because I do think this is a really important initiative that we need to take forward. And then on the point of, oh my God, I forgot. Policy reform. Okay, well, I think short-termism is a huge problem. We have to invest and think in the long term, and our political cycle just doesn't really allow for that often in the current climate. Inequalities, generally, if we have deepening inequalities, that gives greater rise to, you know, kind of, how do you say it? A leaning towards populist notions, being fed easy solutions for very complex answers, as it was also discussed. Yeah, when you're rightly angry at being disadvantaged, you want quick fixes. You don't have the capacity to go and ask and do the labor. The politicians should be doing that for us, and I don't really see how we can get them to address income inequality to the extent that we need them to. So we should all do our work and push from the bottom up.
Yeah. I did indicate I was going to go over here, and then I didn't. So if you can just deliver the microphone there while we continue answering these questions. I'm overstepping my role as moderator now, but let me just overstep my role. Just one resource that at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership we've been developing with Ipsos over a number of years now is a very sophisticated global polling set about attitudes to gender equality, which you can disaggregate by age, and you can see some very concerning factors for young men. And I know that Hee Jung, as our director, is very interested in this topic, and also reaching out, because there are a range of groups that are very specifically working now on attitudes of young men. So we do need to keep doing that, and we do, as an institute, have an event for International Men's Day each year, because we want to make the point that gender equality is an inclusive project. It's better for men, it's better for women, and so we should be making sure that time is used to specifically talk about issues for men. And just, I mean, in answer to your question, or to add to Caitlin's answer, you know, I do think we have to also recognise that in current geopolitics, which, you know, is not being dictated by the Starmer government, nor by the Albanese government in Australia, that geopolitics is being dictated from elsewhere. You know, when you are watching the potential outworkings of that on growth rates in the global economy, growth rates in your national economy, the implications it's got for your government's fiscal circumstances, how much money you can raise. It's got implications for how much you need to spend on defence. Then what is already a budget full of hard choices becomes a budget full of even harder choices. And I think that, you know, governments around the world are trying to grapple with that, to find the investment capacity for things that would pay dividends absolutely over the longer term. I mean, things like Born in Bradford absolutely pay dividends, but it does take money today to reap rewards tomorrow, and that can be quite hard to line up in government budgeting. So are there any other reflections on those two questions, and I'll come out and take the one at the back.
The man at the back's question, yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not going to do your media strategy for how to get it out there, but I think that is a really good point to get this message out there to young men.
Feel free to get our media strategy.
Yeah, because it's just, you can just see, if you look at numerous studies, men are shifting ideologically to the right. Young men are getting more socially conservative. Young women are going the other way. And I think that, we need to have more male influencers, because whether we like it or not, we do live in an age of influencers. I mean, not just influencers, but yeah, I think better than influencers would be genuine celebrities, to talk about, you know, positive conceptions of masculinity, to counter this rise of misogyny, to counter, you know, this strong man, this kind of like populist villain. So
Absolutely. And yes, the question at the long-waited question here. You had a question at the back. Didn't
Yes,
you? Yes.
thank you.
You've got the mic, great.
One, thank you all for everything. I've got a few points, unfortunately. One is language, and a choice over what we use. So today, is it sex and or gender? It's currently quite confused and therefore contentious. And it's come up again, well-being. Again, what does it mean to people, as health and illness seem to be more easily understood? Then, are some currently playing the system? Those who are currently privileged may have an uncanny ability to retain and extend their privilege. How can we caution and steer away from this? And then finally a plea, considering the tiny size of the UK and then the much bigger size of other continents. A plea for geography, geography, geography. And I recognise these maps from 30 years ago at school, sadly enough. But to end on a slightly more positive note, this could be a win-win.
Thank you, thank you. Well, do you want to say something about well-being?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, well-being's a funny thing, isn't it? It can mean going onto Gwyneth Paltrow's website and looking at some very expensive vibrators and yoga mats. But I think, you know, the way we want to be thinking about it is much more holistically. It's a useful word in that it captures health and illness and other things and life satisfaction, but it is problematic because of its ties with other things. I mean, many of you will know that the very small, also small nation of Bhutan pursues gross national happiness instead of gross domestic product. And you think happiness, but then you look at that and actually really what they're doing is well-being, but they call it happiness. So language does matter. I think well-being is as good as a word gets for the sorts of things we would really like to grow as a society, for men, for women, for children, for everybody, for the young, for the old. So I think we have to just try and defend that word from the naysayers and make it clear what we feel it means, and that we feel it is a sensible societal goal. There is an alliance of governments pursuing well-being, also all small nations at the moment, although Canada looks as if they might come on board, and I have heard rumours that Australia is interested. But at the moment, you know, it's New Zealand and Finland and whatever. So I think well-being is a useful term. It's not without its problems, but I'm quite willing to stick my colours to its mast.
And just on the nature of the sex descriptions in the gender.
Yeah, so we are using
in the
sex
data.
Yeah, all good. So we are using sex disaggregated data in our index. These data are the ones that are available to us. Ideally, and this comes back to the points you both made as well, we'd be able to include data that are disaggregated by multiple characteristics that are protected under the Equality Act, so we could capture living standards and how that differs for multiple different groups of women and men across the country.
But not there at the moment.
Sadly not. And also, it depends on us funding our precious statistical agencies adequately.
Right, okay. Right, what I'm going to do is I've been unfair to the middle here, so we'll take quickly, oh heavens, we'll take quickly the 4 questions here in the middle, and then we're going to have to call it a night. So, okay, we're going to get mics passed in from the side, and I might get you to just bring one here at the front, and then we can kind of do it quickly. So who ended up with the mic there? There, okay. Yes, please.
Yeah, really lovely to see this work, Caitlin. Couple of thoughts. Firstly, you talked, all of you, a little bit about long-termism. Wouldn't it be wonderful if Lloyd's funded this so that we didn't have just a single index now, but could get data across time? Secondly, really interested in seeing what you've included and what hasn't been included. For example, the fact that safety or violence against women hasn't been included. The question would, and I know why it hasn't been, because of the data being so poor, and there is a direct correlation between poor data and the main problem in society generally. But if it had been included, do you think it would be saying anything different in terms of the geographical factors? And finally, are there any of those questions that you would take out if you were doing this again, i.e. that haven't really added anything to the story?
Okay. Hold that in your big brain, very big brain. If you can pass the mic and we'll come to you because you've got the mic. Yep.
Thank you. Can you? Yeah, that works. Thank you for a wonderful event. I just wanted to ask, I know we talked a lot about micro behaviors and structural changes, but what do you think we can do as university students on a more so everyday basis, not involved with discussions from the bottom-up approach, especially when the university itself can be a place of misogyny, as I'm sure you saw with the recent lawsuit at Sydney Uni with the sexual assault case?
Okay, we'll take that, and we'll just get these, and if you can pass the mic back once you've spoken.
Yeah, so obviously, thank you for all of this, it was really great. Obviously, it's a gender equality index, so it's focused on quantitative data, but I was just wondering what the role of qualitative data might be on bringing together quantitative and qualitative in shaping policymaking and shaping policymakers, and how we'd go about collecting that kind of data.
Great, and last one, thank you.
Thank you so much, and as a researcher I'm incredibly excited to get into this data, so thank you so much for producing it. I'm also a campaigner as well, so I'm just thinking, like, with the new government putting forward their devolution agenda in the white paper and this piece of research focusing so much on regional inequalities, are there any specific policies or ideas that we, and I'm classing myself as campaigners, could rally for to be included in this bill to ensure that women's voices are heard both now whilst the white paper is being put through, but also to ensure that their voices are being heard kind of like afterwards once the process is done, to embed that?
Okay, all right, we're going to answer those questions now. Now the two in the same row here clearly love the index, love the data. So Caitlin, I'm going to go over to you for answers to those questions.
Yeah, so Helen, thank you on your point about violence against women and girls. We did a data review that showed that there's conceptual and methodological inconsistencies in the data across the 4 nations. And so we weren't able to include that, but we put forward recommendations for improvement and hope to include that in the future, because of course, gender-based violence is one of the most extreme manifestations, as well as cause and consequence of gender inequality. And I found it interesting, your point about the lack of data is kind of part of the problem, and I think that's what we also see with unpaid work. The undervaluation of unpaid work also means that our data on unpaid work is very poor, and actually in the index, we were only able to obtain regional level data for unpaid work, so we're losing a lot of the nuance that is critical for adequate policymaking. And then on your point on candidate selection, were you asking about? Oh no, oh yeah, oh which point did you
sorry,
want?
so the qualitative data was the point, yeah.
Yeah, so
sorry, pointing at you going qualitative. I'm sure you know a lot about qualitative.
Yeah, so I think qualitative data is very important, especially if we're speaking about gendered experiences of the world. The question would be, you know, which aspects do we want to include? Maybe if we're speaking about unpaid work, you could maybe, you know, ask respondents their experience of what types of childcare they're doing to get closer to, you know, which more preferable or more mundane tasks are women or men doing, and how does that shape their lives? So I'm all for including qualitative information in quantitative tools such as the Gender Equality Index, but again,
and is there, with the benefit of this experience, is there one of these indicators you wouldn't use again?
No.
No?
No, I think, well, what we're trying to get here is a profile that goes beyond common indicators, or common socioeconomic indicators of living standards. We want to capture the gendered experiences and their geographic variations. So, if anything, I would like to add more, especially on unpaid work and, of course, violence against women and girls.
And then there's the question about the white paper policy Anybody like to take that?
Well, we need a reminder.
Because the government's put forward their kind of like plans for devolution, which obviously has so many opportunities for engagement in it, and how can we make sure that women's voices are heard both in the process now of creating the devolution like agenda, and also ensure that they continue to be heard in the devolution process once it's set?
It's a great question.
I mean, I think whenever there is, you know, we all need to think about how we feed in and how we widen the network of people who feed in to decision making and policy making, and how we get women's voices from the bottom up there. So we need to think about pipelines. And I think that also comes back to things that were raised earlier. And I just wonder if there's a role for you thinking about deliberative democracy as you take this work forward, citizens of assembly of some kind, maybe some schools-based work like that with young men and women, to also draw out people's voices and to get to that problem of the public generally being treated like they're idiots. That's, you know, the exact opposite of what Citizens' Assembly deliberative democracy sort of tries to do. We feed people facts and expertise and get them to consider it and think about it. And guess what? They have those big grown-up conversations. And quite often that can lead to rapid social and policy changes, as we saw in Ireland over the abortion debate. So I think thinking about the tools we've got to do the bottom-up democratic contributions will help with things like that white paper as well.
Thank you. And then finally to your question, which is change within universities, including this university, Sydney University, for those that don't know, has had continuing and deep problems with sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual assault within its residential colleges, and that's been the subject of litigation. So advice to students at an institution that needs to see change.
So are you at King's then? Yeah. Oh, so it's been a while since I've been at university. So I don't know if I quite understand the question. Could you ask again? Sorry.
We were just talking a lot about bottom-up approaches and having these big conversations, but on a smaller scale, along with micro behaviours, what do you think we can do in an everyday context? Because I know I see it in my classrooms and when I'm on Strand. Like, what do you think are some approaches?
Wait, on the Strand, like literally, like okay. Okay, yeah. It's a big question. I mean, it's really up to, I don't want to kind of have a cop-out, it's up to you. People deal with things in incredibly different ways, so it's not for me to tell you what to do. But I'm sorry, I'm just thinking back to when I was at university. I guess, you know, create a society, that would be the obvious one. Get involved in another society that exists, get involved in student activism, student politics, you know, yeah. I mean, whatever feels right for you.
Any other comments? Yeah, I would say these, you know, overwhelmingly change comes when people find others of like mind and take collective action, and there's, you know, there are moments when calling out behaviour by yourself in a moment when it's safe to do so. I had one of those moments, but then the Parliament's a very, you know, specific kind of format, not necessarily the kind of thing you might want to do in a, you know, on the Strand and get into a difficult, potentially escalating argument with someone. So, you know, there's times when individually you can call behaviours out, but there's more power always when people come together in groups, and particularly women and supportive men come together in groups for change. And I am sure on campus there are a number of groups. We have a lot of young interns come and work with us. There's, you know, motivated people who very strongly in the King's community and want to see change in gender equality, and so hopefully can find each other and be working together for that change. But I guess I'm disappointed to hear that that's been your experience, so it definitely needs to be changed. But can I say thank you to you as an audience for your, we could feel the intensity of your attention. Everybody's stayed with it very deeply, and thank you for a wide range and very smart questions. I think we've pulled at the threads of it in all sorts of different ways. Can you join with me in thanking the panellists who have come here tonight, Maya and Kate? Thank you. Thank you. And could I ask you very specifically to show your thanks to Caitlin and through her to the people who have worked on this incredible report. And please feel free to join us now just outside for a drink and a chat. Thank you very much. Thank you.